then part 4, so those are prevention strategies, right? So it's the primer prevention, systems prevention, and early intervention. But we also need to think about the other side, what happens in terms of accommodation and supports. And so accommodation has to be part of a system of care. And this is really important. It often gets missed, and often gets misconstrued too, right? When you talk about housing first, often people go, that will never work because you can't just dump somebody in housing with no supports. And that isn't what housing first means at all, right? Housing first means get someone in housing and then get the supports to them. But the type of supports that young people need are different than what adults need, right? So for adults, they may need help getting housing and setting up housing and that kind of thing. They may need mental health supports or addiction supports, that kind of thing. May need some financial support, that kind of thing. Young people need all of that, sure, of course. But they also need life skills support, right? Again, how to work with the landlord, how to keep a place, how to do laundry, how to not invite 20 young people to move in with you, right? I stopped doing that myself, right? They need income and employment opportunities, right? So the programs that you set up need to give young people a chance to earn income. Doesn't mean just going straight into a job, because the other thing they need is support and education. If we hold education to be of high value for all young people in Canada, that means street youth and homeless youth as well. So in our programming, we have to consider how do we help young people re-engage with school. If you work with young people who wind up homeless, you'll know some of them have left school and didn't really have problems at school. They liked school even. And others hated school and had incredible difficulties because a lot of the things that contributed to their homelessness also contributed to disengagement with school. So the kind of work that you're going to have to do with young people to get them back in school and support them is going to be different based on the young person. But it really should be at the middle of what you do, right? Keep them in school. That's where you're going to get the bang for your buck over a lifetime, right, as an investment, right? If you just get them, and they've dropped out in grade 8 or whatever, and you don't help them get back to school, then the chances are they're going to have difficulties throughout their lives. But the mental health supports, those are important, and those can be a challenge because for young people, they maybe have never had any connection with the mental health system. Also, many severe mental illnesses emerge during the teen years, things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. Those things often emerge. Sometimes that's the cause of homelessness. When I used to work with homeless youth, there'd be young people that you'd be working with, and then one day they start hearing voices. Like it can happen quickly. And so we have to get young people access to those kind of supports. And then a final thing that's really important is what I call youth engagement. And that involves 2 things. That means helping them develop meaningful relationships with adults, right? So don't create a prison for them, right? Help them develop relationships with others in the community. Help them get involved in the community. Don't make them marginal. Help them get involved in, activities that allow them to develop new friendships, relationships, that kind of thing. But also meaningful activities. Don't just dump someone in housing where they're going to be isolated and bored. All of us here do things that matter to us. I mean, our work matters to us for sure. But when we get home, there are things we like to do. There are things we like to do at night, things we like to do in the weekend. So you want to help young people do that kind of stuff, right? So the necessary components here are, again, to reorient that emergency response so that the goal isn't to just warehouse people, but to help them move out. And again, this is not a criticism of the emergency shelter system because part of the problem is that there isn't places to move young people to. So people get stuck in the system, not necessarily because the shelters are hoarding young people, but because we have to make sure that there is transitional housing available, that there is affordable housing available, that there's housing first models that are adapted for young people. You have to have somewhere to move young people to if they're in emergency services. We have to have very good support for people with complex needs and reduce legal and service barriers that many young people can face. And that's a difficult thing for many young people too because they're transitioning from different systems based on their age, right? So they might be in children's mental health and then transition to the adult system, that kind of thing. And then the accommodation options. This is a bit controversial nowadays. Transitional housing has been a main sort of housing response for homelessness in Canada for years. And now we have Housing First, which is very successful, very popular. We've learned a lot. It's one of the few things we do in the homelessness sector that you can definitely call a best practice, because the body of research that attests to its success is very good. But the success of Housing First means that transitional housing has often, certainly, especially amongst adults, is seen as we have to stop doing that. And I'm not sold on that idea with young people. I think for young people, we need to think about a range of housing options. Housing First may work for some young people, I'd say older youth, but not necessarily for younger people. Transitional housing is often what young people want. They often want to be in congregate settings. I was talking to a young person last week who's now 19. He lived in BC and Alberta and then in Hamilton, and he was saying how he actually really wanted to be in the transitional housing congregate place because he'd never had a family, and he really enjoyed the social aspect, right? And it gives people a chance, it lowers the risk. There's research by Cheryl Forchuk that shows that a lot of young people, Housing First kind of scares them because they want to deal with their issues serially, right? They need a little more support before they're ready to go and live independently. And the other thing about moving people using Housing First for young people is it does kind of force the hand in terms of that, of getting a job instead of staying in school. Because once they're responsible for the lease, unless you're going to guarantee them income supports for 5 or 6 years, they're going to go, why should I stay in school? I have to get a job to support myself. So we need a more nimble kind of response that I think looks at the needs of young people based on their development, their age, and their capacity, rather than one size fits all. So a really good model of transitional housing, which is being piloted in both Calgary and Edmonton, is called the Foyer. And it's a model that was pioneered largely in the UK, adapted successfully in Australia, and is a transitional model that is different from the typical ones. We often have transitional housing models where a person gets 1 year of support or even 2 years of support. And if you do that, then the focus again is going to be on getting a job and becoming independent. I think this makes no sense for young people, 1 year support in transitional housing. It makes no sense at all. If you're 16 or 17 and you're told you can stay in this place for 1 year, oh my God, then you're thinking, what's next, right? And I'm not going to go to school, I need to get a job. So the Foyer is really good because young people can stay for extended lengths of time. The focus is on education, getting young people back in school, but also getting a job, right? That kind of thing. Lots of life skills, lots of good mentoring, wrapping the support around the young person. The best models really are client-centered, not, again, getting the young person to fit the Foyer program, but having the Foyer support the young person. And we've also, at the Homeless Hub, developed a report on this that gives details and a toolkit for how you can develop this kind of model in your community. And you can do it in all kinds of different ways. You can do it with a scattered site model, right? So you support young people living in their own apartments in different places in town, so that lowers your capital costs, right? But you can also do it in a small facility. You can buy one house. It's what they do in Australia, right? They'll buy a house with 3 bedrooms or 4 bedrooms, and then you have the staff worker who stays there, and then young people have their own apartment and they can stay there. They go to school. In Calgary, Boys and Girls Club runs a program like that called Havens Way. Both Calgary and Edmonton, as I say, are piloting the Foyer, and Calgary Woods Homes is doing it, and what they're doing is targeting young people leaving corrections, right? Because that's a big deal, right? So it's very cool. And then the Housing First approach does work for a lot of young people, right? Again, it has to be done differently. Don't just take the adult model, apply it to young people. One of the challenges with Housing First and all that body of research is it focuses almost entirely on adults. We actually know very little about how Housing First works with youth. We're in the process now of developing, I was going to tell you this, a framework for Housing First for youth that actually looks at how you build transitional housing in as one of the options. Again, because if Housing First is about client choice, which it is, and the young person wants to be in a transitional or congregate environment, or doesn't want to hold the lease, if that's their choice, then our Housing First model has to accommodate that. And so I do consider that there is a role for transitional housing. And so I'm going to conclude here with a confession that is going to help us think about how we should deal with youth homelessness. So I have a major confession to make here. I have 3 sons. 2 of them live in transitional housing. And that place is called my house. Okay? They're young adults. They're in school. They're working. They're learning to live independently. They both want to move out, desperate to move out, right? They make mistakes. We have good times together. We also argue. They're irrational but also rational, just like me, right? All of us are, right? They make good decisions and bad decisions just like me. And they're getting time to grow into adulthood. But it's transitional because someday they have to leave, and they will leave. And so what I don't understand is with our response to youth homelessness, we don't take the basics of what we know is required to raise a young person into adulthood, to raise our own young people into adulthood, and build our response to youth homelessness around that. In other words, give young people time. Encourage them to stay in school. Let them know that they're going to have adult support. Your comment about respect is important earlier when you're talking about your grandfather. I think that one of the things we often miss when we deal with youth is we deal with them in a very disrespectful way. We make assumptions about them. We're often very judgmental. Respectful encounters are everything, right? Treat them with respect, but give them time. Give them the safety to make mistakes, the time to grow into adulthood and be happy, right? And it won't all be easy, right? Those of you with kids know that, right? Like, it's not easy. Life is complicated. And if you think back again to when you were 17, it's not easy, like moving into adulthood wasn't easy either for a lot of us, right? But we have to really be committed and build our response around that. Stop building it around what works for adults or even what works poorly for adults. Develop something that's built for youth to help them grow into adulthood. So a lot of these resources you can find on the Homeless Hub. And and we generate stuff all the time. So go to the Homeless Hub. We have a weekly newsletter where we highlight the best of what is known in terms of research and policy around homelessness. And if you have reports and things that you develop in your community, we can help push them out, right? So that's one of the things that we will do. So questions now?